quick disclaimer. Opinions of host and guest do not represent the views or opinions of Functional Movement Systems. Always consult your physician before beginning any exercise program. This general information is not intended to replace your healthcare professional. Welcome to the Movement Podcast. This show is all about movement. We tackle it from different angles, bring on guests, answer questions, go on a few tangents, and give practical advice, giving you guys a better idea of how you can optimize the human body to be the best it can be. Let's preview what's coming up in this episode. We love hearing from you, the listener, and getting an idea of what is on your mind. Today, we do our last mailbag of the season and answer your questions. We discuss the guys' personal workout habits, book recommendations, their take on CBD, special advice for training kids going through puberty, and much more. So let's open up the mailbag for today's episode of the Movement Podcast, powered by FMS. Thank you for listening to the Movement Podcast. We have in studio today both Gray and Lee, and we are actually going to be doing another mailbag episode. We had a lot of success with this last time, and so we've collected some more questions for you guys. I also wanted to say a shout out to Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio. We have a lot of new listeners from there, as well as Toronto, Canada. We have a big influence in that area apparently at the moment, and then also Sydney, Australia. We have a lot of new listeners. So we're constantly gaining listeners, and people apparently want to hear what you guys have to say.
I'm glad somebody does.
All right, so we're going to get started with some of these questions. Our first one actually comes from Instagram, at Efficiency in Movement. And he's asking, do you squat and deadlift to maintain strength on a regular basis?
Like personally?
Mm-hmm.
Not as much as I should. I wouldn't. I'll say this. For me now, I think I've kind of graduated from worried about weights, more just trying to maintain body weight. So I do a lot of squats. So I do a lot of body weight squats, at least probably 2 or 3 days a week. And probably more of the deep knee bend where I raise my heels up on the half roll that we've kind of been kicking around. I'll do that a lot. I don't do as many deadlifts as I should. I definitely think single leg deadlifting, with me personally, if you guys have been paying attention to this podcast, which hopefully you have, I've had a previous fracture when I was younger, so I'm definitely asymmetrical. So a single leg deadlift is something I need to work in more than I should. I don't because it's hard. But squatting definitely, and deadlift, I think for me, it's probably more maintaining, less about just trying to create strength. That's me personally.
I hate to agree, but I think I probably am squatting a lot. I do some squatting movements with Indian clubs, balance beam stuff, but I'm doing more body weight and I'm trying to maintain my options in the squat pattern. Deep knee bend, single leg squat, single leg competence. When it does come to deadlifting, I'm not currently doing strength training now because I'm doing a whole lot of work on the property, but I can't think of a better way if I were trying to sort of change my body comp, up my hormone levels, maybe challenge my bone density, not so I can go out and compete in the deadlift. There's no better fingertips to toes tension. So I do think there's going to be a point or age in your athletic body where you probably don't need to load the squat to maintain a good squat. It's probably better to maintain squat mobility and deadlift strength. And so when I've got to make those decisions, just like Lee, I'm going to try to maintain every shred of my squat and symmetry, even at body weight, because that's where you're going to need it at the end. And if I did want to add a little bit of lean body mass or maybe boost testosterone a little bit, maybe once a week deadlifting and do some carries in between.
And when you said property work, you meant actually like on your
I'm a lumberjack.
I
am a lumberjack 2 days a week. So
The one thing as a follow-up that I do more of instead of lunges that I think helps me because of my asymmetry are split squats. I do more split squats and lunges rather than deadlifts. And I'm not saying I probably should be doing more deadlifts, but for me, that's where I get up against that barrier.
So for the listener, the difference between a split squat and a lunge.
Split squats, you're stationary. You keep your feet like 1 foot right in front of the other, like a stride, and you just go up and down.
Up and down.
Whereas a lunge, you're stepping out and coming back, or stepping out, stepping out, stepping out.
Right.
I think it's an important thing for people to hear, because if there is an obvious difference in your split squat, why would you even ask there not to be in your lunge? If the lunge without a step is already messed up and gives you all the awareness you need to know you need to gain integrity, and let's go one step below that, that's where chops and lifts come from. You're down on one knee. So if we can see it in a chop and lift, don't do a split squat. If we can see it in a split squat, don't do it in a lunge. And if we can't see it in the first two, then work it out in a lunge. And that's literally the way we're doing it. So I think that's awesome, being able to do that split squat first. So.
Okay, this one comes from Instagram again at Alyssa Liu. What are signs a person can look for to determine if they are doing a movement correctly versus creating a pattern of compensation? When we only know what our normal is, how do we educate ourselves to strive towards optimum levels of movement?
If you're looking for feedback, I think one of the things is spine sparing, and I'll go into depth in that. If you're doing a lunge or a squat, and you're moving your back more than you're moving your hips, your knees, and your ankles, you're probably doing it wrong. So there are certain moves, especially in yoga and gymnastics, where you do reorganize and move the spine a lot. But in a lot of classic fitness exercises, the spine's not really supposed to move that much. Think the squat, the lunge, and the deadlift. The spine's not supposed to move. Mm-hmm. And that's a dead giveaway. And if you want to know if the spine's disorganized, just look at the neck and the head, and you'll see a head that's sort of awkward, or a neck that's straining, or something like that. So inappropriate straining in the neck, poor head position, and a lot of back movement are dead giveaways that you're compensating. And good spinal posture during exercises that we know would do better with that, look for that. And that's the first thing to do. And most people, when they go into a deeper squat or a deeper lunge or try to pull a hard deadlift, you will see that spine move first, and that's a dead giveaway they're doing it wrong.
I'm going to be, I'm sure if I've got confusion on that question that a lot of people out there listening probably do, so I'm going to ask you to repeat that question.
Okay.
Because I wasn't quite following it.
Yeah, so what are signs a person can look for to determine if they are doing a movement correctly versus creating a pattern of compensation? When we only know what our normal is, how do we educate ourselves to strive towards optimum levels of movement?
Well, I'll say, kind of following with what Gray was suggesting, everybody's going to compensate, because that's the way our brain is wired. Is if I've got a limitation, you're going to be likely to compensate much more than you're likely to do the movement correctly. Mm-hmm. So my first point would be, make sure that you understand, if you're the person asks this question, or any of us out there, make sure you have a good understanding of what correct is, what is normal, because what the person is doing is normal for them, right? So, and that normal, maybe as Gray suggested, the spine is not in the right position, or their knee is caving in when they squat or whatever. They may think the knee is out, so they don't have that awareness that Gray's been talking about a lot. But I think we have to understand also that the brain is wired to compensate. Whether it's bending down to pick up a set of keys, or whether it's trying to squat with weight, that we're always compensating around an area of weakness. So I think what we have to do is make sure that the person understands that that is not what they should be doing, but it's what their body is accustomed to do around the problem. I'm hoping that makes sense.
No, and it does basically take us to a deeper question. Policing yourself in exercise is something you can do once you have an objective perspective. And without a movement screen, you don't. So even if you do all your exercise perfectly, you can still have a functional problem. You will just be not as dysfunctional in those exercises because you know how to pose them right. But when you reach back to your fundamental movement patterns, you will do poor things. So there's no way, if you're asking for ways to sort of screen yourself in exercise, that's what we've always done. And we realized that wasn't cutting it, which is why we arrived at a movement screen. So the movement screen tells you which exercises you can be hyper vigilant on, so you don't have to worry about all exercises, just the ones where we know your compensation is going to be your weakest link.
All right, so next we're actually going to go back to our really common question that we get. I think people are very interested in what maybe you've been reading or what you have read in the past and books that you highly suggest to people within the career. So what are your top 3 healthcare provider or even in general books?
Right now, I'm going through the second pass of Sanjay Gupta's book. He's the CNN health correspondent who happens to also be a brain surgeon. And what I hear him saying chapter after chapter in this book is your brain and your body work together in such a great way that movement is one of the best nutrients for your brain. So if you're 80 and you're trying to decide whether you need to do a crossword puzzle or take a walk with a friend today, this guy basically said, don't worry about the superfoods. Don't worry about, all these supplements. Get out, move, and use your brain for something more than games, and actually have a full engagement in that. It seems to be more protective for brain health, dementia, and early Alzheimer's than anything else we could do. And so when you got a brain surgeon who basically said, I became a medical journalist because research wasn't making it to the masses quick enough, that guy basically grabs my heart, man. And the fact that his message arrived at the exact same place ours has, because when we look at musculoskeletal risk factors, that's our wheelhouse, and how many movement signatures there are that help us see that, and look at those same things in healthcare. The musculoskeletal health, healthcare, and brain health are the same thing, looked at through 3 different windows. So if you're in movement in any capacity whatsoever, from PE teacher to yoga instructor to physical therapist, chiropractor, get this book and support this guy's message, because he's pointing them at people who can help them move better. And a lot of people are going to try often before well, and we're going to link together on that and make a difference.
I'll take it a step further. I think with part of what you're getting at, I think too often we gravitate to audiobooks. I know I do, especially as much as I was traveling. But I think people probably need to start reading more. Like, read the book. Don't just listen. Now, Gray, I know you have to listen to it, right? Based off of how your brain works. But I think reading right now is probably something that I think will, challenge the brain as what you're kind of getting at, rather than just listening. But as far as my books, anything Simon Sinek, Malcolm Gladwell, I gravitate to. Right now it's also Measure What Matters. I can't think of the author's name because I'm listening to it, not taking my own advice. And The Tipping Point is another one. And then When Breath Becomes Air. Those are the ones that I'm kind of into right now. But one thing, we get this question all the time, and to a degree, and I'll say this, it does frustrate me a little bit, Gray, because I think people need to read, in my opinion, this is my opinion, take it for what it's worth, is figure out what they feel like they need to learn more about. What do you need to learn more about? And I think that's one thing that I admire about you, Gray, and I can't believe I said that in front of you, is that you are always doing that. You're always devouring books that you figure out, okay, this is something I want to learn more about, and you do that. Don't just listen to me say, I listen to Malcolm Gladwell. I mean, part of what I've had to do over my process is read more about running business. How do you run business? And that is up against my weakness. I mean, part of the things I've read over the years have been things I'm not interested in, but I know I need to learn more about them. And I think people just take people's advice and say, oh, I'm going to read that book. Well, think about things that you want to learn more about, or that's going to help you grow as an individual, and go look for those things.
No, I've challenged myself in the exact same way, more in a leadership capacity, developing courses and developing instructors and developing, I think, the way we sync that together. I've taken on that burden, and Leaders Eat Last is Simon Sinek. Start With Why is Simon Sinek. And as I was deep into writing the movement book, I was one of the early adopters of these books. And the one thing I do try to do is, if I'm listening to an author that's been highly recommended, I look for both the parallels that maybe I've already done, and I also look for some of the things the obstacles that I'm not facing. and I actually try to apply it. I don't just enjoy it. And I think Lee's right. Whichever way to consume this material allows you to imagine and sort of reflect on the material better. I convert every word I hear into a picture in my head. So when I got an audiobook going, I actually imagine better than when I read. Danielle, my wife's just the opposite. She reads, she can release her creative side and not have to focus. But I always am listening to something else in my head when I'm listening to somebody, and somehow it works out. Atomic Habits, James Clear. And every now and then you got to do a book for enjoyment. And Matthew McConaughey reads Green Lights. And if you just get a little too puffed up with yourself and just need to eat a slice of humble pie with a guy who has no reason to be humble, but he is too, I thought that was a great little, how can I say, cleanse the palate before you go deep into heavier philosophy or logic. So.
Yeah, I'm going to have to put that one on my list as well. And the Sanjay Gupta book you were referring to is Keep Sharp.
Keep Sharp, yeah. And I can't recommend it more highly because I don't think he is sitting on any of the data that we've been collecting in movement, and yet he's saying the same thing. And so when I hear the exact same recommendation come from two unbelievably well-vetted perspectives, what are you waiting for, a third? So.
Okay, our next question. With the recent popularity of CBD, what are your thoughts on its use and even effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean, right now, again, it's one of those things that if you try it, if you need to, it probably is not going to work for everybody, but there's certainly data that suggests it does. But it's one of those things that if you've got some ailments or you get working with somebody that has some ailments, try it out. And, my wife has definitely tried it, did not like it, did not have any benefits from it, didn't feel it. My father-in-law, same thing, felt like it helped him out a lot. So it's probably one of those things that it's being what it is, get past the stigma,
right.
But try it out.
Yeah, I think it's anytime you can have a more natural alternative to something that's probably developed in a lab and has 4 patents on it, you're probably better off. Having said that, the question we have to constantly ask ourselves is when we are seeking any remedy to reduce our symptoms, you got to ask yourself, why do you have symptoms in the first place? And so if I'm taking ibuprofen regularly because I run constantly dehydrated, that dehydration causes a headache and a little bit of lethargia, then I think that my headache is slowing me down, so I constantly take ibuprofen. And so if you find yourself sort of sampling different ways to manage your symptoms, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, how many hard medical signs do I already carry that are explaining these symptoms? And I can't explain to you guys the difference that when my wearable devices tell me I have had a good night's sleep and my state of readiness is good, and when I've had a poor night's sleep, and it's that amazing. And you're wondering, what superfood did I eat yesterday? You didn't. You basically got an extra hour of quality sleep, and it affected your state of readiness more than anything that you want to take or something like that. So, your cycles of life are broken. We'll make a drug that makes you feel better about it, but it won't last long, and it's just covering up the problem. So if you're going to use something to manage your symptoms, use it so you can work a little harder without stirring things up in the direction you need to. We're not children anymore. We don't need a lollipop every time we skin our knee. We need to know why we keep skinning our knee.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that is the takeaway. The takeaway is, why are you needing to rub or CBD oil on your body or take an aspirin? Not, does it work or not? The answer is, yeah, it works, but why do you need it? And then only use it to get you to a better point.
Yep. Okay, this one's a good one. It comes from @BowRealBB. Why test rotary stability in the FMS unilaterally instead of on a diagonal pattern?
I'll take a stab at this, and then Gray, I bet Gray chimes in here too. I don't know. But the one thing about the rotary stability pattern is we have to, let me just answer this first to start. We have to challenge different postures and positions. That's the first. So we have to get you down in a more fundamental posture. And if everybody should be able to crawl, which everyone around the world should be able to crawl and do that diagonal pattern, then we've got to challenge you at a higher level and see what at the higher level can you do certain things. So if Gray or I or whoever designs a test that we know going in everybody should be able to pass, then that's a bad test. So we have to challenge you at a little bit higher level, which is one reason we put you in that that same side flexion extension pattern in the rotary stability test.
No, I think most human beings walk within an 8-inch corridor. A great way to refine your gait and posture is to make you walk on a 4-inch balance beam. Okay, so yes, exactly what Lee said. We've got to make a natural pattern a bit harder, but let's think a little bit deeper. We're not creating screens to look like exercises. We're trying to make exercises help screens that actually relate to everyday life, function, and probability and things like that. When we make you do a unilateral, very awkward rotary stability test, you've got two choices. Do I round my back or do I shift my weight over the arm and hip? And most people that aren't organizing their core in a reflexive way, not in a practiced way or conscious way, but this is, you know how a cat always lands on its feet no matter how you throw, okay, this is our opportunity to be a cat. The cat doesn't know you're getting ready to throw it, right? or knock it off the fence or something like that, but it knows exactly intuitively what to do in midair to land on its feet. This is our one station where we hope you haven't practiced this, because you will either authentically round your back and disorganize your spine to save your limbs from working harder, or you'll actually do the right thing with your limbs to conserve your gyroscope and your spine. And so when we give you a unilateral and you don't do well in that, you could have a more intuitive and reflexive core than you currently do simply by training differently than you currently are. And when you do that authentically, you're training pretty well. You're a pretty highly tuned person, even though you may not be running your half marathon every month like you think you need to. You're staying right in your lane as far as having reflexive core stability. And every other test we do in fitness is so conscious, contrived, and practiced. It's nice to have these little, let's see if you land on your feet when you don't know where you're supposed to land. So,
and the other thing, Greg, just to mention, a lot of you, if you followed us, maybe some of you all listening looked at the FMS 5 or 6 years ago. We've made some changes to the rotary stability test to account for the poor distribution in scores. And the interesting thing I always want to bring up is too many people assume that we're wanting you to get the best score, right? And that's not what we're looking for. We're looking to see if you get the worst score, right? We want to make sure you're not scoring poorly on this. So you've kind of changed up how we do the test. Not trying to get more people doing better, but to identify the people who are getting worse or not performing well. Because in the old way of doing the test, everybody was getting like the diagonal pattern we used to do, which told us the test is not giving us what we're looking for, right? So we changed the test. Now we're getting a lot more ones, which is really what we're trying to identify. And not so much to just score you a 1, but to make sure we were correcting the right thing, because people were not doing well, as you call reflexive stabilization, but then they go into the push-up and they weren't doing a good push-up either. So we're trying to fix their push-up, that higher, what I would say, higher threshold position, which is a push-up, versus more of the lower threshold position where you react and respond, which is the rotary stability. So I think that's a big thing for people need to understand, is that we're looking for that lower threshold reflexive stabilization like you just described, as opposed to the higher threshold, which we see in the push-up. So we're testing it 2 different ways, and it's not so much that we're trying to seek out people who can do a great job on that same side movement. We're just seeing how bad are people in that same side movement.
No, I can't tell you how refreshing it was to make sure the distributions in that rotary stability looked like the distributions in our other test, and we felt we needed to bring that to it. So those adjustments, as Lee said, the screen is designed to identify failure. And what I mean by that is, if you try to use this pattern in any robust way, in any often way, in any highly intense or frequent way, things probably are going to go worse for you than the average person. And that's what we're trying to do with the screen. So we don't want you practicing these patterns. These patterns have to tell us something about protecting you. And what we saw was it makes common sense to people to say work on your shoulder stability than work on your shoulder strength. Well, most people are working on their core strength, but there never has been, other than a few great balance tests, a way to look at your core stability. Yeah. When you do a Y balance test, it's easy to think about it's about your leg or the arm you're posting on. But when you do a rotary stability test, it's hard to blame anything but the core. And we see a nice relationship between that on feet, on hands balance and a YBT and that rotary stability test. So we've tried to refine the test, but not to make it look like an exercise. So it truly captures your core control when you're not thinking about core control.
Physical inactivity is a leading contributor to many health-related problems, but throwing a lot of exercise at it without looking at movement quality can just make the problem worse. At FMS, we are wanting to empower everyone to see movement through the lens of function. So for a limited time, we are offering our course, A Common Sense Approach to Evaluating Movement, for free to our podcast listeners. Visit functionalmovement.com and get your free course today. Follow the link in the description and use promo code CSAPOD at checkout. That's CSAPOD. Now let's get back to the podcast. Okay, up next, any advice for junior high coaches to focus on with their players who are going through puberty to improve performance and lower any injury risk? Lee, you worked with
that is a tough. I think mentally and physically, everything that's happening during puberty, male and female, definitely needs to be taken into account. So I think just focusing more on body weight activities, making sure that you can gain keeping the mobility as much as possible. I mean, you're talking about hamstrings that are going to be really tightened and toned up, posterior chain. It's going to be tightened and toned up. So anything that you can do to just maintain good fundamental movements is really what's needed. Don't try to load them up with weight and do all the crazy stuff and, just doing the basics during that stage. So when they go into it, again, I think the biggest thing I'd say is go into it knowing what their functional movements are. That's key, even at that age. And it may be just doing a motor control screen, upper body, lower body motor control screens, some of the basic mobility work, and trying to maintain that as much as possible. They're going to lose it. There's no question. They're going to lose it, but going in, trying to keep that and do more body weight activities, basic mobility work. So when they come out of that, by the time they're 14, 15, 16, because again, puberty for some people may start when they're 11. Puberty for other people may not start till they're 15. So that's the other thing. Don't just assume that everybody's starting at 14, 13, 14, 15. It's going to be different for everybody. So that's why I think just doing body weight basics and trying to maintain it is more important than trying to get them in the weight room and do a bunch of bench press.
I'll go one step further and say I'll even give you the program. I've done it with all three of my daughters. I've done it with some of the teams they're associated with and a lot locally. Find a grass hill. You're doing bear crawls up the hill and you're backing down the hill like Spider-Man. So it's not a bear crawl with your butt up in the air. You're nice and flat, sort of Spider-Man going up. When you're coming down, you're doing hip mobility. You're getting that knee almost in your armpit, sort of scaling down. So you never face downhill. You're always facing uphill. That unloads the shoulders, loads the legs more, gives you pretty good cardio and core going up the hill and great hip and ankle mobility going down the hill. As soon as you're tired of doing the bear crawls, you turn around and face downhill in a deep squat and get that groin stretched out, and everybody can deep squat on a hill, okay? Jump rope, you can do that in the gym floor and you can do it on stall mats outside, and jump ropes are really cheap, and you need to keep that energy storing gear there too, and then find a balance beam and basically do what I call balance beam agility. And what that means is you're not just walking forward, you're walking backwards, you're sidestepping, you're stepping on and off, and you're tying your shoes and stand up and tie your shoes. And so if we do the combination of that primal crawl with hip flexibility and deep squat built in, I got my cardio taken care of. And most of the thing you're going to see in this junior high to early high school group when you start running them hard, shin splints and low back pain. It's coming. They've got growing pain. We got Osgood slaughters. We got arches that are collapsing. So if you run them into shape, you will run them into the ground. But if you crawl them into shape, they'll be ready to run in about 3 weeks. So the jump rope's going to keep those feet and ankles strong, and the balance beam is going to keep them from getting sloppy. And this is the reorganization Lee's talking about. There's no need to go above body weight because their angles are changing every day. Their hormones are changing every day, and their body comp is changing every day. They're a little bit dehydrated, so when they're doing these things and you see them all of a sudden dump coordination, they're already dehydrated. They're not mental processing. But this is a great way to keep them functional through a growth spurt. But that's the program right there, and you can do more. But if you're doing less than that, or you're doing more fitness-associated stuff, you're underserving them. They're not conditioning right now. They're reorganizing.
That's great. This one is coming from @TeamPFHSC. What do you think could potentially be your next modification for the FMS screen?
That's hard to say because really we have to watch the data. And I think the only modification, we're always trying to make it better, let's be honest. But I think right now we made 2 modifications based off the data and the research. And to be honest, Greg, what people don't realize is we added the ankle mobility in. That took about 3 years. We changed rotary stability. That took about 4 years. So these modifications don't just happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an assumption. So I think right now it's going to be not less modifying the FMS. I feel pretty confident. And we will, I'm sure, at some point, but we got to watch the data based off of what we've seen over the last 20-some years. But I think it would be modifying maybe what we do with the information. How does we take the information in, what do we do with it coming out? I think that will change. And I think coming up with different, looking at other pieces of information like sleep, like nutrition, like stress, these other factors that we've been talking about a lot here recently, how that may impact movement and how movement can impact those things. Those are pieces that we'll be paying closer attention to, I think, as we continue to evolve.
No, spot on the money. A movement screen is simply that which it is. And I have really enjoyed watching our movement screen serve a lot of different populations. And to me, I almost use it like an eye chart now. I just use the movements as a standard. People are always wanting to do less and get the same information. I can't blame them. I want the exact same in every subject matter but movement. And in movement, I'm like, no, you need all the information you need to make the kind of decisions that you make. But what I hear Lee saying is your state of readiness when you read an eye chart or your state of readiness when you do a movement screen means a lot. And so the last thing I want to do is take somebody who screens poorly due to sleep deprivation, dehydration, and an inflammatory diet and give them a corrective exercise when they showed up smoked. And their worst pattern, of course, was expressed mostly through the screen, but it doesn't mean they need to stretch or exercise. It could mean that they're walking around with 3 potential points on the movement screen that hydration, sleep, and a non-inflammatory diet would help. So, I no longer feel the need to monkey with the screen because it's not broken. Our way of ascertaining your state of readiness is very broken right now because just because we got wearables doesn't mean we're using them. And when we do use them, we sort of say, well, yeah, I probably do feel better, but we don't have then a physical expression with which to hang that on. So I've been doing that for about 3 or 4 years now, and it's really changed some of the ways that we teach corrective exercise, meaning that we're going to try to recalibrate that breath every chance we get. We're going to try to gauge your awareness every chance we get. We're going to try that controlling a situation is usually spreading it out over your body instead of isolating or focusing on one point. We've seen those exercises basically break bad patterns quicker, but if you're in a bad or toxic lifestyle, the bad pattern's coming right back around. It is an expression of the stress. So I feel that as Lee said, we will add attachments and the screen will become one station of physical appraisal. Your biometrics will become one. Your awareness of your most destructive and constructive behaviors will be one. Before we know it, we'll probably be deleting more crap from your lifestyle than we'll be adding, and you'll be moving better in the process.
Yeah, one thing to add to that thought, Gray, is we are at a critical point coming out of this pandemic that stress is up. Who knows what body comp's going to be for most people. And the solution that's going to be given is exercise. I read an article right before coming up here to do this today is cracked teeth are up 70%. Dentists are seeing cracked teeth. Now, that's all because people are grinding their teeth. Why do they grind their teeth? Stress. Up 70%.
I'm thinking bone density too.
Right. Right. Bone density.
Both ends of it.
Yeah.
You're getting softer and you got more stress.
Yeah. So all of that is what people, and again, the solution, okay, let's start exercising. Well, exercise, as the data says, could be a problem. People go into exercise, they get injured, they don't know what to do. So we are at a critical point that we've got to be considering a lot of these other factors along with movement. And most people, and I'll say this, I'll look at the professionals and say, most professionals don't consider both. They're either gravitating to mindfulness and, making people meditate, or they gravitate to movement and make people exercise. Well, both are equally important, especially now.
And what you just mentioned, exercise can actually be a risk factor, is when we look at risk factors that really alert us that we probably should back somebody down off exercise, or there's pain in movement, and we can easily see it in the screen. There's asymmetry in mobility or balance, and there's a loss of one of your fundamental patterns. If you got any of those things going on, exercise potentially, especially if it's consumed generally, is going to make you worse.
Mm-hmm. All right. We've got another question. This one is coming from Marco off of Instagram. When does the psychological aspect maybe influence movement?
All the time. I mean, I think movement of behavior. One, we get into, our environment dictates our movements. Our movement dictates our environment. So you can't separate the two, in my opinion. I mean, because, how you... Again, I think, the one study that was done years ago in the military is that, and again, I'm going to try to connect the dots here. Gray, I'm sure he'll have an opinion, is that lower scores on the FMS in the military, this was an officers candidate school. So these were 22-year-olds primarily going into their officer training. If you score low on the FMS, you're more likely to get injured. What it also said that if you scored low on the FMS, you're also more likely to drop out. So there is a psychological component to people who are moving poorly. They just don't feel as confident. Whatever how you want to spin it, there's something there that tells us. And then you take into account of the people who are, if you think you can touch your toes, but you can't, and you say you can, versus the person who says they can't, but they can, who's more likely to be injured? The person who thinks they can do the movement, but they really can't. They're more likely to have a problem. So there is a psychological component that I think definitely warrants a lot of investigation that we haven't really tapped into.
No, think about it. How come you got to do an eye test at the DMV? Because a lot of people walk in there half blind, not being responsible about their vision, assuming that the way things look through their eyes are the way things look. And the DMV is the last defense we have
Thank
to
God they do that.
Keep them from driving 75 when they are in a 45 or something like that. So, I don't think these people are walking in the DMV wanting a license so they can put other people at risk. It's just, if you've been looking through cloudy eyes, that's what you think the world looks like. And if you've been moving through stiff joints, that's what you think movement feel like. And if you've been moving through a sloppy core for years, you think a tight low back is what's supposed to happen at 3 o'clock. No, that's what's supposed to happen if you don't have a core. So I honestly think that the day of us picking our own exercise and the day of us assuming what our biggest physical limitation is pretty far gone. If you haven't had a callus on your hand in 10 years, you are so physically removed from your body, even if you do show up at the gym every day. Start with a screen, figure out where you are, work on your weakest link, and watch the miracle happen, because your body will heal itself with good movement, just like it'll heal itself with good food. But if you're so busy counting sets and reps and looking in the mirror, you're never going to know. You're just not. So you need an outside perspective. And for those of us that offer people an outside perspective, convert your opinion into data, just like we've been doing for 30 years. We had very strong opinions right out of school about what we thought sports medicine, physical therapy, physical conditioning, and development ought to be. And the screen and that base and that objectivity and that radical transparency has kept us honest and kept our eye where it needs to be. And so, that's why we always take every conversation about exercise and physical development and say the subject of the sentence is not the move, it's who you're doing it to. And you don't know who you're doing it to if you don't have some objective data on them.
All right, guys, thank you so much for coming in, and thank you all for listening and submitting these questions. If you ever have a question for the guys, you can actually DM us on our social media or visit us on our website, www.movementpod.com. You can record a video of yourself as well and ask a question or just type it out. That'll do it for this episode of the Movement Podcast. Thanks for listening, and if you liked what you heard, please take a minute to subscribe and review. If you want to learn more about our system and take the next step in your movement journey, visit us at movementpod.com. Until next time, be sure to first move well, then move often.